Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi everybody, and I'm Philip Eidson, and welcome to episode 86 of the Art of Procurement. And earlier in the year, I went to a seminar at a Spend Matters and ISM conference. It was in Baltimore, where one of the speakers was Rob Hanfield. And after the event, I talked to Rob, and he actually came onto the show. His episode is episode 52, and we talked about predictive analytics. But the reason that I mentioned that is that at the seminar, Rob shared a slide that talked to some research that his team at NC State had undertaken that showed the average time and position for a CPO as measured against the value levers that the procurement organization of that CPO was pulling. And to cut a long story short, those CPOs focused solely on cost savings and some of the more traditional procurement tactics had a lot shorter time and position until they were let go versus those focused further up the value chain. And one of those value levers that CPOs were pulling that added to their longevity was supporting the CFO and the Treasurer in the act of cash management. And so fast forward to the summer, and I was fortunate to meet Amber Christian, and Amber is the founder of ConsultAce. And as you hear in the show, Amber has an extensive background in Treasury and in cash management, focusing on developing and implementing working capital solutions, implementing accounts receivables, accounts payable, treasury, and cash management solutions. And so when I talked to Amber, I knew that she would be a perfect person to ask about procurement's role in supporting cash management, in supporting the CFO and the treasurer. And so that's the topic of today's conversation. We discuss a couple of primary areas. First, what role can procurement play in supporting the treasurer and the CFO in cash management? And we talk a lot about payment terms, for example. And then we look to data and analytics, as Amber shares how analytics in the cash management space can be used by procurement to unearth a number of different sources of value throughout the supply chain. And before we head into the show, I just want to let you know that, and you've probably seen this on social media, is that I'm busily recording content right now with a broad range of subject matter experts as part of the Procurement Revolution event. And so the Procurement Revolution is essentially a platform for a number of different procurement thought leaders to share their perspectives on the future of our profession, and then the role that we must play in really challenging the status quo as we look to redefine and expand upon our value proposition. And throughout the week of the event, it's going to be 26th to the 30th of September, we're going to be sharing a variety of pre-recorded and live content. So it will be a selection of content that's really released every day during the week. The event is actually going to be free to register, so there's nothing to stop you, listening in and engaging in the content that's shared, but also in being a part of the conversation and part of the discussion. So to learn a little bit more about that and to sign up to the event, remember it's free to register. Just head on over to theprocurementrevolution.com. That's theprocurementrevolution.com, and there'll be more information there. Okay. Let's head then straight into my conversation with Amber. So hi there, and welcome to the latest episode of The Art of Procurement. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I'm delighted to be joined today by Amber Christian, the founder of ConsultAce. So Amber, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Philip. It is a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you for joining me. And, when I look at your background, you're definitely an expert in the treasury and cash management space. So as with procurement, it probably isn't something that you dream of doing, I don't think, when you grow up. Certainly procurement wasn't for me. So how did you get into the profession?
Oh, yes, I didn't grow up dreaming to be a treasury consultant on SAP. Yes.
So how does that happen then?
I will admit that. Sure. So in my first job out of my undergraduate degree, I had a management information sciences degree from the University of Minnesota Duluth. And so I was meant to be a techie. And I went to work for General Mills, a Fortune 500 company. And as part of their rotational program, I actually landed in SAP. And as I moved around different positions, I had an opportunity to work for Treasury on the implementation side of SAP. and I fell in love with it. I had a great mentor that I worked with that is the assistant treasurer there, and it just was absolutely fascinating to me. This combination of the finance processes and what Treasury did and their strategy, and then how you could layer technology on top of that. And I've ended up spending my career on that because I love that intersection of all of those things.
It's interesting that it's like that in procurement. So the vast majority of people that I talk to in procurement space, myself included, did exactly the same. You kind of fell into it and for whatever reason just got the bug, kind of fell in love with what you did and never really saw a reason to go on and try something else.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's for any of us that finds a passion about something. Yeah. You just keep digging and digging and going. And one of the key things I've learned is those passions build upon themselves, right? Mm-hmm. You know, you start learning about it, and then you have this great set of experiences. And then more people want to work with you because of that first set.
Right.
But maybe they have a little tweak to how they want to do it. And pretty soon you end up with this mushrooming of really interesting skills and projects. And that's how it's worked for me. And I expect you probably could say the same. You know, you start building that set and then you start moving around.
Yeah. No, that's definitely happened to me. And I was always somebody who, you know, I never really wanted to do the same thing for my entire career, but then found a function where that's so different based on the roles that you do, that you can actually have such variety even if you're staying in the same profession.
Yes, absolutely. I have found the exact same thing. And the Treasury industry has really had a lot of challenges in regulations. Mm-hmm. And even if you go back to the early 2000s with things like Sarbanes-Oxley and all these rules and things that affected not just Treasury, but finance, procurement, you know, affected all of us. But particularly within Treasury, boy, once the financial crisis hit in 2008, a lot of things started changing. And we've had this really rapid pace of change and new regulations and then technology disruptions that go along with it. And so that's made it a very interesting industry to work in.
So what is it that you primarily do today?
So I do a mixture of things. My primary business is really still in the consulting space.
Yeah.
So I've been doing consulting now for more than 8 years, but I've worked in that Treasury area for over 13 at this point in time. Now, when I say Treasury, I really mean anything that touches cash. Mm-hmm. So we're talking AP, AR, traditional cash management, as well as Treasury. And I've built a lot of these consulting experiences, and I do a lot of writing as well. So I take a lot of these things I learned, these in the trenches, and the places that the projects go right, the places that go wrong, and how to provide some of that pragmatic advice.
Yeah.
And for companies that are working on their own operations as well. So it's both consulting as well as writing, and then finally I also do a fair amount of speaking as well.
And so we were talking actually before we went live on, you know, the fact that you're obviously talking to a lot of treasurers. So I'm interested to understand, what do they think about procurement? What's their experience with the procurement organization typically?
Well, true confessions, right? Not what happens with procurement.
Don't worry about offending us.
I have to be honest, right? You know, but the practicality is it's really a mixed bag. Mm-hmm. And I think procurement has a big role in what that looks like. So in most organizations, the interaction that I see with Treasury, it's really evolved in the last few years. So I've seen many organizations that have tried to really centralize contract management and negotiation.
Yeah.
So that has been a big key trend I've seen across a number of large corporates. And that's really, it's a mixed bag because Treasury has some uniqueness to the space because you start to get into things that touch banks and some of your external parties. And that's a little different than your traditional IT contracts. And so sometimes one of the challenges is even just in the education or in working with some of the procurement professionals to understand what is negotiable but what isn't negotiable as well. And so that's a key. So sometimes it can be a great relationship when you can work closely and the person's willing to listen and understand what they can and can't negotiate. But if they think they can negotiate everything, then it can be challenging, to be very honest.
No, I've So I've seen that where teams that I've led have had responsibility for buying, corporate services that the treasurer happens to be the internal stakeholder for, and a lot of it is related to banking. And there truly isn't much that's too addressable in the banking space. You can go in there and kind of say and look at it and say, well, you're spending hundreds and hundreds of $1,000,000. Well, the reality is most of it's probably just cash that's flowing, and the managed service part of that is relatively low, and there isn't actually that much that's negotiable about it.
Exactly. I mean, there really only is a certain amount you can negotiate. Treasury often has very strategic relationships with their banking partners.
Yeah.
And if you try to really negotiate down on all the operations and the things that they pay, well, then you can find yourself in situations where maybe they're part of your facility, so they're part of the backup funding for your company. Mm-hmm. And so Treasury has this really strategic role, and it's good for procurement to understand that there might only be so much margin in what they can negotiate, even though it might be big dollars, because those dollars are related to the transaction cost to do business, to send payments, to receive in lockbox files, et cetera. And that there's some room for negotiation, but there isn't infinite room for negotiation. And race to the bottom isn't always the best idea when you come to banking services, because you have to know who's going to be there. Is there going to be someone to pick up the phone? Is there enough business there that it's profitable for this bank as well?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of complex factors that go into those Treasury decisions.
And I guess, it's when you're relying on them for cash as well, it's a much bigger impact is the cost of capital that you're able to access through some of these same banks that you're then trying to squeeze on a transaction cost. So when a treasurer looks at it and a CFO looks at it, it's far more important to maintain the relationship than it is necessarily to get a couple of extra margin points on the services side.
You're exactly right, Philip.
So do you feel that treasurers and the Treasury Department understand what procurement can do and vice versa?
Yes, I do think Treasury professionals do understand what procurement services can do for them. Treasury, as many years, has really been the overseer of working capital for most organizations. And because of their unique role of seeing all the money that goes out the door, all the money that comes in the door, and is tied up within the door somewhere, they really have to have a good view of that. And so I think they actually really understand the lifeblood of a lot of what's happening in your organization more than you might expect, because they've had to be so peripherally involved in some of these services, and because they're so involved in most cases in at least overseeing working capital and at least understanding, where the numbers are and what they mean. So I think they have a good understanding of it. It's all about creating that working relationship and being able to create the win-wins, I think, with Treasury that benefit them as well.
So is working capital the number one thing that keeps a treasurer up at night? Or do they have other major priorities? I'm thinking of areas where procurement can support the treasurer.
Yes, and I'll say that the number one thing that's really affecting treasurers is really out of procurement's hands. To be very candid, it's a lot of these regulations. A lot of Treasury organizations are getting hit really hard right now with something called Reg 385. And it's got a lot of organizations in a difficult position because it affects how they do some of their internal financing and then what the actual effects on their books are of that financing. So I'd say the first thing that keeps a lot of treasurers up at night is the changing regulations. And so Reg 385 is one of them. But the important one, and where procurement actually does have a little bit of a role in this, is one that's called Basel III. And you're going to see this one coming over the next couple of years. This is a phased-in implementation. And what this one is really saying, okay, let's look at the banks and let's look at what kind of funding they have to cover the different types of deposits they have. And this is where working capital plays into it. And so an organization who has a bank as their primary bank for working capital, those are considered sticky deposits because they're coming in, they're going out, they're being consumed. And so for the bank, from a perspective of how much funding they have to cover it, they call liquidity coverage ratios, there are lower requirements for working capital than what we call non-operating cash. So what your treasurer is finding that is happening and is going to keep happening is for the money that gets tied up in working capital, they have, it's a little easier actually with the bank. Those are the deposits they want. But with the excess cash, they may find themselves in situations where the banks say, I don't want it.
Right.
Because they actually have to keep a far higher liquidity coverage ratio for it. So it's like a penalty to have extra cash. So it's a little counterintuitive. But why this matters to procurement is the role you have to play is really around the forecasting and the prediction around your working capital and your purchases. And what are you going to be doing as a procurement organization? Because you have a hand then downstream in what happens with the AP as a procurement organization. And you can help work with the treasurers to say, well, what's that ideal circumstance look like for working capital? Mm-hmm. Do we need to talk about maybe more diversified sets of terms, maybe more consolidated sets of terms? Really be strategic to say, okay, how are you affected by this, and what's my role to make this a little easier, because I understand how this regulation is changing things for you.
So I do want to talk about payment terms, and that's something that I've always found is something that is obviously influenceable by procurement, and maybe and I'm only talking from personal experience here, something that I didn't necessarily pay as much attention to as probably what I should have done, because you negotiate everything else, you kind of leave payment terms to the end, and then if the supplier throws up a stink about you wanting to extend them, then you just kind of give them what they want. I know that payment terms are, as I've learned more and obviously matured more in my career, how critical they can be to working capital. But how do you balance the payment terms that you set with a supplier versus, the needs that the supplier may have and the capital needs they might have? Because obviously whatever you set has a big impact on their ability to cover their working capital needs.
Yes, that's very true. And payment terms in so many cases is exactly what you described. I don't really think about them up front, mm-hmm. and I just deal with them at the end. And so what ends up happening is you have got this crazy mishmash of payment terms. It's not standardized, it's not consolidated, and it means that your flows are all over the place. And people override them. Well, do I want discounts? Do I not? The place to step back and think about payment terms is to be more strategic about that and look at your suppliers and really say, in working with your treasury organizations, to say, does it make sense for me to try to negotiate discount terms in some of these cases? Because they may find that as they look at their cost of capital or they look at their overall cash positions, no, take the discount terms. We'd rather pay early. We'd rather have that cash flow go out sooner with that discount, depending on what our cost of capital is.
Right.
So you have this balance of saying, okay, maybe I need to strategically look at my purchasing, and maybe for certain sets of things we have industry standards like a net 30 or maybe it's a net 45, and look at that to say, how do I standardize and bring it in a little sooner in the conversation instead of it being the little box you check on the form you fill out when you set up your supplier. That's pretty late in the game for you to have any strategic or tactical advantages or work with Treasury, because maybe they want a once-a-month payment term because it's everything that comes all the way up to the end of the month, then gets paid on a certain date the next month. There's all kinds of ways to play with it, but it needs to be a more strategic conversation as opposed to an afterthought, because otherwise you have a situation where maybe I push out 45 days. Now I'm going to push 60 days. Yeah. You're really going to push on your small suppliers in particular. If you do a lot of research, the small suppliers end up providing quite a lot of financing to large organizations because they don't have as much room to squeeze. The place to be careful then is, oops, I don't want to bankrupt my supplier. Yeah. So you have to, instead of just pushing out the terms, you might have to be a little more creative in those financing structures that you set up with your suppliers so that you don't end up ultimately pushing them out. which means you lose diversity, and now you have more supplier risk because you have less suppliers.
Yeah, and that's been my experience in the manufacturing space when I've worked in industries where you set standard payment terms and then you just arbitrarily say, okay, I'm going to extend them by another 15 or 20 days because I'm in a short-term cash crunch, really without any consideration on the suppliers themselves. But then once you've put them in place, they kind of stick. So you don't then go and take them back. You're just putting more and more pressure on your small suppliers.
Exactly. And you get in a cash crunch, so all you do is just push out terms.
Right.
This is the other big misnomer. And in this last year or so, I've really been looking at some new technologies, right? And this has brought me deeper into the procurement space and further upstream. Because a lot of the technology providers are now moving to new applications and new ways to analyze data. And so something to think about, even from a procurement function, is the easy answer has always just been, oh, I need a little extra cash, punish my suppliers.
Right.
Bang my fist on the table, I'm pushing out my payment terms on you, you have no say in the matter. And people they don't know what else to do, so they sort of roll over. But you know what they do? Ultimately, you pay higher prices.
Right.
Okay, this comes around, and I'm gonna embed more in my cost, and you lose in other places. It isn't fair to think you can just shove out the terms and that you aren't going to have higher costs somewhere else. The practicality is people have to recover that somewhere. So you're going to see it baked into higher material costs or into other places in the process. And that has to be understood by multiple people. And a lot of people just think, well, I just win. No, you might have to step back to find out, but you've lost somewhere in that game of doing that. But even, as we talk about the terms, there's other places to look for savings, and it's not just on the payment terms. Organizations should be stepping back, and this is where we actually are making some big technological leaps. And this is where the service providers and the technology providers come in, because we're actually seeing a lot of changes in this space from a technology perspective and an analytics perspective. And so now we're actually seeing people that could say, well, let me show you the data all the way through the purchasing cycle. I could start from the purchasing requisition to the purchasing order to see the goods receipt, the invoice receipt, and ultimately the payment. Because maybe part of where I'm at, or I'm rushing to make payments at the end, or I'm having to make some shortcut choices, are because something's hung up in my PO creation process, or there's too much time in there. So I think that an opportunity for procurement, it's not just around the negotiation of the terms, but it's looking holistically at their whole process. And that's a big game changer that's just coming down the pike now. The first providers are out with that, and so the first real opportunities are there for procurement to do those types of things.
So what is it then that, you mentioned that service providers are starting to provide kind of the access to the information you need to do that. What is it that they're doing? What is it that they're able to bring to the table that allows the procurement organization to think a little bit more strategically about the flow of cash through the supply base?
So what they're really doing is they're typically taking advantage of some of these in-memory technologies that allow them to really crunch through millions and millions of records of your data. But more importantly, for the first time, you're starting to see people, instead of thinking of things as disparate one-off activities, they think about it as the life cycle of a transaction. So think about it as, I start from the purchase requisition. I have links to the purchase order. I have links to the goods receipt, the invoice receipt. I can actually see across that whole channel what's happening. So now I can actually analyze what's happening between the various steps in the process, and I can start to correlate and see effects of what's happening in my transactional systems and processes. If we think about it, our core transactional systems aren't meant for that. They're meant to scale, to capture data, and they're meant for throughput of that data. They're not really meant to analyze totally across process. That's where these new opportunities are coming in, and that's where big data has a play. Cross-process analytics really has a play in this, and you're really starting to see more and more use cases for that. So someone in procurement, you can start to actually look at and say, oh, well, is there a correlation between electronically receiving the purchase order and my overall DPO when I make that payment. You can start to say, oh, well, how much time is it taking between these steps? And what's actually happening, which allows you for the first time to actually diagnose at the individual transactional level. Instead of just some rolled up aggregate thing through business intelligence, you can actually start to really get to the heart of what's happening in that core system. And so that's where it's new, and that's where it's a game changer.
Pardon the interruption from today's interview. I'm really proud to be announcing that I'm bringing the art of procurement into a live webinar format. And the idea is that it's not just a typical webinar. My intent is to provide value to registrants both before and after the webinar, rather than the usual one where you register, you show up, you listen to the event, but you don't really find it, it's not easy to implement a lot of what was discussed, usually because of a lack of time when you get back to your desk. And so I'm going to be hosting a webinar with my friends at RFP 365 on September the 13th, 2016. It's going to be at 11 a.m. US Pacific time. That's September the 13th. And what we're going to be doing is talking about how to use weighted scoring when you evaluate your RFP responses. So what is weighted scoring? How do you determine if weighted scoring is right for you? And then some tips from the experts who really live and breathe RFPs day in and day out. So to find more about the webinar and to register, just head on over to artofprocurement.com/RFP webinar. That's all one word. That's RFP webinar. All right, let's go straight back into today's interview. So I know you talked in a supply and demand chain executive article actually about some of the different metrics that you can measure and the data points that we'll start to be able to get that we can make decisions based on. And what I'll do is actually link up to that in the show notes, and I'll give the URL at the end of the episode. But I wonder if you could just share what some of those kind of key areas are that procurement leaders can look to gather data on to help make some of those decisions through the cash process.
So one of the keys that I would introduce, that anytime you're starting to look at analytics, because we're all hearing about big data, right? And people are saying, oh, I got to have big data. I got to have big data. What do I do with it? How do I actually use it to transform my organization and do something practical with it? And I'm coming from the, hey, on the ground in the trenches with companies, how do you start to actually build something that's useful? And so I created a model, and it's actually a risk management framework, and said this is really the way to go to actually build out your analytics program so that it's something that's useful and helps you get comfortable with where you're going with analytics. When you start moving into this world, there's a whole new host of skills that people are learning, and sometimes that's a little uncomfortable. And so to get your feet wet, what I tell people to do is, start in your analytics programs with identifying what I call known knowns. And a lot of these are things that you measure today. They're your KPIs. They're things like, how about lost discounts for accounts payable? That's going to expose some problems. Well, why are you losing the discount? What is that dollar value? What's that costing you? How about, as we talked about payment terms, how many different sets of payment terms do I have? Is that adding unnecessary complexity to my procurement processes? Because people pick the wrong ones, or there's problems with them, or frankly, are they even what I agreed to in my contract?
Right.
Because let's be honest about what happens with master data systems as well.
I've had examples as well where you have analysts in accounts payable just paying on invoice because that's what the invoice said, not necessarily going by any payment terms that are in the system.
Yes, exactly. You see these types of things all the time, and so you have to take a little bit of a step back and say, okay, these known knowns are things I can identify. It's a lot of my master data. It's what kind of payments am I issuing to people? If I'm still printing a lot of checks, that's a conversation we need to have, because that's actually more expensive than you think because of check fraud, because of services around it, consolidations at the banks. You should probably be moving to electronic payments. But how do you understand what that looks like? So first you capture these known knowns, and you're doing a lot of this today. You're just going to put these in this framework. And as you get comfortable with that, then you start looking at the known unknowns. and you start looking at, well, what is this costing my organization? How about early supplier payments? A common one that I see in a lot of organizations is, well, I issue my ACH payments once a week. I hear this all the time, or maybe twice a week. I said, you know what that means you do? That means that for a lot of your suppliers, you're paying them early.
Yeah.
Because in reality, let's say I pay them once a week on Monday. I run my payments on Monday. What everybody does is nobody wants that angry supplier phone call. So what they do is they say, okay, it's Monday. I'm not going to issue payments again until next Monday. So let me pick up everything that's due from now to next Monday.
Yeah.
I just prepaid a week's worth of invoices. This is this known unknown. Well, what's that costing my organization? And if I annualize that, how much extra working capital am I spending? Because I have a process that maybe needs adjustment. So this is an example of a known unknown. So then you start to get comfortable with, okay, these things that are a little bit more vague. And then as you get a handle on that, you start to understand, oh, okay, well, now I'm predicting some of my savings. And then ultimately you start to make the leap into what I call the unknown unknowns. Now you're going to start to see relationships between things that I might not have anticipated. And so maybe I'm looking at what is the effect of some of my procurement decisions in my race to the bottom on cost, on supplier risk, what revenue is at risk. Now I leap from the procurement process to the revenue generating part of the process. Because maybe as procurement, maybe some of these raw materials or things I'm purchasing, as you said, maybe I should give up a little bit of margin because I only have a small set of suppliers and I have a large set of revenue tied to the need for this material.
Yeah.
That's where starting to shift and looking and correlating your data is really a game changer for procurement. Because think about what decision would you make differently, Philip, if you knew that as a procurement professional.
Right, and you just don't know it. So it's not that you're making decisions wrongly, you're just blind to it because you don't have that information when you're making those decisions.
Exactly.
So you talked about the fact that you need to build out an analytics program to really start getting access to this level of information. Is that Treasury led? Is it Treasury and Finance, Treasury, Finance and Procurement? Who's leading that, and what role can procurement play in building that program?
It's actually a cross-functional effort, and a lot of times working capital initiatives may actually come from the CFO directly.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they come from the finance organization. Because as you really look at working capital, working capital is your days payable outstanding, your days sales outstanding, and your inventory outstanding. In other words, you're pretty much crossing every major business process your organization has.
Right.
And that's why it's so complex to manage. And that's why it's so hard to it can be hard to get your arms around and can be hard to get some of the visibility there. And so in terms of those efforts, those often come as cross-functional teams, and they really should come from cross-functional teams. And so as you may have a group that is really looking at your DPO, as an organization. That means you need procurement, you need accounts payable, you need treasury. You usually need people from your lines of business that represent their perspective as well, and from different levels. You can't simply say, okay, well, it's just the people that lead the shared services organization, the person that leads the procurement organization. You have to have a mix of the people that are in the trenches that understand the operational effects of those strategic decisions, and then people at a strategic level that may understand more about the strategic effects of the operational decisions.
Yeah.
So it really has to go both ways and be a cross-functional team that represents each area.
And so as a procurement leader, if you don't have access to the kind of information that you talked about, the first stop is really a conversation with your treasurer or your CFO to understand, I guess, if there's plans in place to build out the capability. And if not, then, maybe there's an opportunity for us all to partner together to get that level of granularity in data. And then here are some of the ways that you will get an ROI on doing that.
Exactly, and whether you look to third-party applications that do it or whether you look to your software providers, even the conversation, the first step is the conversation and the awareness that, I'm procurement, I need to talk to AP. AP just isn't the issue of the payment. You'd be amazed what AP knows about what's going on inside your organization. They know where the bodies are buried, figuratively, because they have to deal with getting all of these things out. And Treasury is the exact same way. And so it's really a cross-functional conversation and an appreciation for what the other person deals with, because sometimes the solutions come from different parts of the organization. But until you're having those conversations, you don't even know what the pain is. And so as a procurement person, you may not understand the effect of maybe you haven't centralized all your invoices and somebody's being a little territorial, well, my invoices got to come across my desk, but they always go in late. And then you find out what's happening in AP with those invoices and the yelling suppliers and all the other things. But until you have that cross-functional conversation with people, you can't really get awareness of it. Because sometimes the answers are simple and it's just better communication. And maybe periodically we all got to be in the room and talk about it, as opposed to often our department kind of doing our own thing and trying to optimize our individual areas when we should be optimizing across our processes.
Now, that's an important point, that we often operate in silos rather than really bringing together and thinking about problems more holistically. But I had a follow-up on the fact that, procurement, we're always trying to look for new ways that we can bring value to our organizations over and above saving money. Because, that is ultimately what will define our relevancy, I think, in the future. And I think this is definitely an area where we can play a much greater role and address some of the concerns and challenges that, the leaders in the company have that we don't necessarily think about all the time. My question is, how often is procurement at the table? And would a proactive procurement leader who comes to a CFO or treasury talking about these kind of things, are they going to be looked at as, well, that's what they should be doing coming to me? Or are they going to be looked at as in, it's really nice to hear procurement driving the conversation?
I think it all depends on the approach you take when you walk into the conversation. If you walk into the conversation with an open mind, because, you may hear some things you might not want to hear about your organization, and we all have to walk in and hear those, about our respective areas. But if you're open-minded to the conversation that says, okay, where are we doing things well? Where can we improve? What does it look like as my customer? Because if you think about it, all these other departments are your internal customers. How often do you gather feedback from them about what it looks like from their end? And I think if you're willing to engage in dialogue, that really opens things up. But not just the dialogue. Do you actually do anything about it and actually make any changes? Because I've been in a number of organizations where, we take this wonderful list of feedback and then nobody ever incorporates it differently and nothing ever changes. That gets very disheartening for other functions if they see that. So I think a key piece of it is understanding if procurement's genuinely serious about that type of transformation or that type of conversation, how do you get more embedded in these processes so you can see it coming? And I've seen a lot of situations where I've had projects held up literally due to contract management. And you can't get to people, but nobody knows what's going on, and it's just unresponsive. That doesn't look good for the procurement organization because it just looks like they're unresponsive. Well, maybe there was something going on, but you don't know. So I think it's that communication and that being well embedded in the processes, that makes a big difference. And being open-minded and truly implementing change is another key part of it.
All right. Well, I think it's definitely on our agendas as procurement professionals and leaders to push areas where we can bring more value for our organizations. So this is definitely an area that is kind of interesting. It's one of those things that, as a practitioner, I'd look at it and think of it as being, that's not part of strategic procurement, because strategic procurement is when we're going and negotiating all these multi-million-dollar deals and building fancy category strategies. But at the end of the day, this may actually have a bigger impact on the success of the company and their access to cash than any nice strategy that gets you a percentage point or 3 or 5 off something, a medium-sized contract that you're building.
Exactly. If you go to a treasurer and you say, as a procurement organization, I understand what's happening in Basel III, and I understand the regulations and a little more, I have a little better appreciation for what's going on in our external funding situation. How does procurement help you as part of that conversation? I don't think most treasurers are going to shut you down from that conversation. Because they're going, oh, I have to move cash, or I've got these other things. And then you can start to have good conversations about how good a forecasting job do you do, which may lead you back to our payment terms or other conversations. And then you can start to introspectively say, okay, now this is truly a partnership, because it's really both those organizations coming together to say, hey, and it's actually an outside influence that is sort of that causes the situation, but there's a lot of that going on in our industries today, and saying, well, how do we work together so at least we're one face of this, and we're working together in a more integrated and holistic fashion as a process.
And so I just have one last question. It's not really related to how we ended the conversation there, but it was something I had earlier that I wanted to ask and just omitted to do so. And this is, there's often a lot of debate of where accounts payable should fit, whether it's a finance function, if it's a treasury, if it's a shared services, if it's a procurement function. What do you see? How often is accounts payable under procurement versus another area of the business?
I typically actually see accounts payable as a shared services organization, and it often commonly reports to finance. That's been the big trend that I've seen. And I think that's just due to the nature of the payment. And what often happens with the AP organizations, one of the reasons they go into shared services is they move both accounts payable and accounts receivable. So the cash in and the cash out. And so typically those shared services functions are going to sit within finance, because they cover so many different processes. They cover some things for treasury, they cover things for procurement, and as well as maybe they may actually issue payments for payroll. There's a whole broad base of services. So it's less common that AP sit within the business. Now, that being said, some of that is really driven by the level of centralization for your organization. In organizations that have a centralization philosophy, that's typically where I see a lot more consolidation and then reporting up into finance. However, there are definitely plenty of companies that have a decentralized philosophy, where they, especially if they're in acquisition mode or they do a lot of acquisitions, this is pretty common. And so they may choose to leave decentralized services, which may still sit out within the procurement of functions, because maybe they acquire and divest companies. And so in those
they just don't want to integrate it all the time.
Exactly. They don't integrate in those cases because they may divest you if your profitability isn't at a certain level, et cetera. So some of it is really about that integration philosophy in terms of where I actually find it sitting inside organizations.
Interesting. And then there was something else that came to mind as you were talking about that as well. Insource or outsource, is there a trend one way or the other, or is it very specific on the company and the company culture?
In terms of the shared services function?
Yeah, in terms of whether AP is an internal organization or whether it's being outsourced.
That is a complete mixed bag right now. You see some going out, some coming in, and I don't see one key trend either way. I thought more was coming back in, and then lately, as I've talked to a number of other companies, I'm still hearing about it going out. So that one, there isn't necessarily a key trend. The key trend is really around how do we do a better job of automation and leveraging tools and technologies and having less manual intervention. I think that is a key trend for a lot of people. I think procurement's in that boat as well, right? How do we manually intervene less, because we know the time it takes, the mistakes that can be caused as part of that.
No, I could actually go on and talking about that topic as well, because it's something that comes up more and more in the procurement space. But, I'm really cognizant of time. So as we wrap up, I'd just like to ask you where listeners can find out a little bit more information about you, how they can reach out and contact you if they're interested in continuing the conversation.
Absolutely. And I would be happy to continue the conversation with anyone that wants to follow up with me. So the easiest way to find me is through my website, consultace.biz. But you can also find my company on LinkedIn as well. Or you can find me tweeting on Twitter. I'm under Ace Treasury. So there's a number of ways you can find me. Or frankly, if you Google me and put in Consultace, you'll find my email address and contact information as well. So any of those mechanisms, and I welcome the conversation. If people have additional thoughts or other questions about, how do Treasury and procurement interact better.
Well, no, I appreciate that, Amber. And what I will do is I will link up both to the supply and demand chain executive article that I referenced earlier, plus your LinkedIn profile and the website and everything that you referenced there. I'll put them in the show notes. And they're going to be at artofprocurement.com/cash. That's artofprocurement.com/cash. So Amber, just finally, I want to thank you very much for your time and for joining me and for sharing some of your insights with Art of Procurement listeners today.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you to our listeners.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.